anyone with adolescents in their lives wrestles with this question of where to put the line about how much agency, how much responsibility to give them or to think about that. But that's an easy thing to throw out and say as a parent or whatever, but the stakes get really, really high when we're talking about juvenile justice and our system. Both BJ and Joanna came to me in the break excited about building on the conversation that we've already started to have and have things that they want to say. So I'm going to kind of start us going, but I'm also going to let them do their thing a little bit.
Serve and return.
Serve and return, exactly. We're having a serve and return going up here. So BJ, let's start with you, though, about how you think brain science is informing what's happening in the courts and juvenile justice, and where I know you have a whole bunch of things you want to talk about, so take it away.
I'll first just, is this microphone okay?
Just hold it up a little more.
I want to build on what Dylan was saying about the developing brain, and also just to underscore the potential for change in the brain throughout the life course. Yes, there are massive changes in the first 2 decades of life. These changes, I think, are a beautiful evolution of the brain to adapt to the situations that the individual is going to be facing at those different time points. And so it's not surprising to me that brain circuits that are involved in reward and threat and stress are changing and show peak changes during the adolescent period, because those are exactly what an individual needs: reward to pull them out, to explore. The ability to detect stressors and threats to actually thrive and survive as they're exploring is very important. But this peak change is occurring at the same time that we're seeing gradual changes in prefrontal circuits that we associate with decision making and reasoning. And so much of my work, when Adriana was a graduate student with me, was we got very tired of hearing people talk about adolescents as if they were defective cars. So no brakes, no steering wheel, just an accelerator. And that was some of my favorite colleagues, as well as journalists and educators, still will describe sometimes the brain that way. And so I think what has been important from the brain sciences is the nuanced situations in which adolescents are even better than many of us in this room in making rational decisions quickly, accurately, and learning. But in situations that actually call on those circuits that are, we're seeing really rapid changes during adolescence that involve stress and emotion, reward. This also includes the influence of peers that we see this circuit responding to as well. I think that when you're trying to engage in decision making and you have those emotionally charged and social situations, that's when we see a difference in really diminished, sometimes, ability to make good decisions. And usually in these emotionally charged situations is when our young people come into contact with the law. So one point I just want to make sure we keep in mind is, by trying to protect young people, we don't want to say that they can't make decisions, because we know they can, right? But we want to understand the circumstances and the situations in which their decision making, even when they know better, can go awry. And that's going to be informative to in the juvenile justice system. Judges and lawyers just want you to have one age demarcation when the brain is mature. The brain is never mature. It's still developing, even for an old fart like me and a few others in the room. So, because our brain is adapting to every situation. And Dylan beautifully highlighted the point of some of the extreme behaviors that we see in young people that get them in contact with the law is adaptive in terms of the environment they're in and their lived experience. And so keeping that in mind. I want to come back, but I want to actually defer to you, Joanna, for making any comments relevant to this. But I want to talk about some of the changes that we have seen in our legal system and some of the changes that we have not. But yeah,
well, Joanna, why don't you, we'll come back to that, but why don't you sort of start in with how you, my question to you was, how do you feel all that information is getting translated on the ground in your experience, and And also I know that there's this really important question of state by state being different.
Yes, the state-by-state piece. Hi, everybody. It's such a privilege to be up here with the two of you and to be in this room with all of you. I come from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, wearing a couple of different hats, yes, and Philly in the house, where I spent most of my career working with young people facing the most serious charges in our criminal legal system and juvenile justice system. We have what's called direct file in Pennsylvania, which means the burden is on the adolescent, on the young person, sometimes as young as 10 years old, to fight their way out of the adult legal system and to prove to decision makers that they deserve a chance to be treated in the juvenile justice system. And so much of our work, we developed a new model at an organization called the Youth Sentencing and Reentry Project of trying to combine what we knew about the science as lawyers, not as scientists, with storytelling and individualized narratives and mitigation strategies that we borrowed from the capital context. And I think to your question, what has continued to be really challenging is how that information is received by the decision makers, by elected judges who are very concerned about the next election cycle and about the narratives that are pervasive in the community, not just in Philadelphia and in Pennsylvania, but around the country, about the criminogenic tendencies of poor Black and brown young people. And so we had this incredible base of knowledge that you all have pioneered, and yet the translation is so incredibly difficult in the courtroom on a case-by-case basis, in the state legislature, with our local policymakers as we were trying to shut down adult jails and prisons that were housing young people. So I think just lots to discuss in terms of the application in particular jurisdictions, but also the day-to-day reality of trying to work with young people, center their expertise, and support them in avoiding the harshest possible consequences.
Let me just, I know, and you're going to take it away here, but I want to throw in this idea that hopefully you'll address it on the way here. Because one of the things that you all brought up in the prep call is the extent to which developmental principles apply across adolescence and the extent to which even the science is different kid by kid. And when we get to extreme behaviors is obviously one of the cases where it's different. So I'm just going to throw that out there, BJ, and see if that...
I love that question, and I think it's really important because honestly, when I take, and we as scientists need to take every opportunity to educate policymakers, voters, judges, and we do. And I do think in some cases we're making a difference, but often the pushback is, you are telling me about typical brain development, and that doesn't have anything to do with what we see with the extreme behaviors and psychopathic traits that are observed in young people who are committing these crimes. Well, let me just be the myth buster on that one right now. So extreme behaviors, what we see is they map onto the age crime curve, just like functional changes in the brain and changes in behavior in typically developing individuals is changing during that age crime curve that peaks around the late teens to 20s. And so even without an intervention, you see most young people with psychopathic traits, and most people lawyers don't like for me to even use that term. But this is because we need to educate individuals and let you know that you see a decrease in violent crime as a function of age. And with the right interventions, the youth-targeted ones, you get an even bigger decrease, and that decrease is just as big in individuals who are rated very high on psychopathic traits as low. And this is some of the beautiful work by Caldwell that came out in 2011, but it's just not getting out there.
Interventions at what point?
So this is interventions actually in juvenile and incarcerated
Once
youth.
they're already
when they're
incarcerated.
in there, making sure that they're getting treatment and we're not being punitive, which is what our system is too often based on. And so the other thing that,
I'm sorry, can you just say a little bit more about what that treatment, what does that mean?
So this is a treatment that's more youth-based. So some of the early treatments were associated with conduct disorder, and so you might have a heightened emotional arousal, and so you want to help the individual regulate themselves. Well, there are individuals where you actually want to upregulate those emotions in situations in which they're watching or seeing someone in pain or that harm being inflicted. So it's very different than what traditionally would be given, if anything at all. But there's just one other point I want to make about the extreme behaviors too, and that is this potential for change in who we are. There's the myth that who we are and our identity is formed early in development, and then that's stable. And that's so not true based on what we know from personality development. In fact, it's well beyond the 20s and 30s and into the 60s and 70s. We're all a work in progress that you see in two personality traits that are very important in terms of self-regulation. And one is emotion regulation, and the other is conscientiousness. And you just see those abilities increase. So it's very important, as we're also seeing the potential for change in the brain, that we link that to the beautiful psychology and personality research that has been done too.
Joanna, are there good examples of things that, could you tell us some stories of things that worked in your experience, or individual cases where the right thing happened?
Yeah, I can. And actually, BJ, what you just said brings this to mind. In addition to the work that we were doing with young people, so I said between 10 and 17 and a half, trying to keep them out of the adult system, we're also in Philadelphia at the time that the Supreme Court's Eighth Amendment evolving jurisprudence was happening, and Philadelphia being the epicenter, the world capital of sentencing children to life in prison without parole. And without parole in Pennsylvania means absolutely no opportunity for release, no review, you leave prison when you die. And so over 500 people across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania serving that sentence from as young as 12, 13, 14. The Supreme Court cases come down, and we find ourselves in this maelstrom of needing to move the cases forward, think about reentry for the first time for this population, for individuals who had been inside for decades since they were children. And this conversation about the brain constantly changing, constantly evolving, being able to tell the stories of expressed conscientiousness within these horrendous and devastating circumstances in prisons across Pennsylvania, how the individuals that we were working with were the leaders in those prison facilities, how they were the mentors for the young people who were coming in behind them. The discussion in the courtroom at each of these resentencing hearings about plasticity. And these are people who, again, all first and second degree homicide convictions, some of the most gruesome, horrendous fact patterns that you can think of. So it's not to minimize that, and we always were doing the work of really trying to thread the needle, not to minimize the harm that was caused, but to tell the story of resilience, of plasticity, of change, of evolution, of the life that had happened inside since they went in as teenagers when they had no expectation that they would ever come home. I think to me has been the profound experience of a lifetime to see that happen in real time, and then to watch all of those folks come home. Not all yet, but we have made tremendous progress. We have over 200 folks who are home now. The longest serving person in the world, actually, I think he did, gosh, my math is gonna be off, over 50 years. And he is in his 80s now, and he is thriving as much as he can be based on that history of incredible trauma and incarceration from the time that he went in. But they are coming home, and they are leaders of organizations, of nationally prominent organizations. They are informing the conversation for reform in Pennsylvania and beyond. And they're also living their lives. They're thriving. They're parents. They're getting married. I've gone to baby showers now and weddings with folks who I met in orange jumpsuits inside of the prisons. So to me, that speaks so much to what you were saying, BJ.
So, yeah, and I just want to tap in because I think what we're underscoring and that we've heard already this morning is the importance of that lived experience. So one sort of opportunity that previously incarcerated young people have been given, and one that I've experienced that you're well aware of, is the Center for Justice, and it's the Ambassadors Program. And you have previously incarcerated individuals coming together with policymakers, and they're listening to one another to try to make change. And I have not been to one of those forums yet where I'm not just in tears, because we didn't give those individuals any opportunities, and yet they're the ones who are coming out and fighting the hardest, and they're our leaders. And it just, it makes you want to do so much more for young people. But I also want to get to what we're not doing for young people, too. Should we go
for it.
So I might even have to pull out my statistics because I was trying to get the latest. So yes, under the Obama administration, solitary confinement was banned at a federal level. That is not the case state by state. And so the latest ones I could find, if anybody has better ones, that would be great. There are still 15 states that have no limit on the amount of solitary confinement time that a juvenile spends in that confinement. Moreover, young people who have not even been found guilty of a crime yet, so they're being detained, are still being detained in horrific facilities because their families cannot pay bail. So there's been a lot of bail reform. Last count that I had, and this one's from I think it's from 2020, there are 18 states that allow bail still, young people, juveniles. They're incarcerated. They haven't even been found guilty. They're separated from their families. They're treated like a criminal. 26 states are silent. And honestly, that is as damning as those states that are actually still requiring bail. And is it okay for me to share a case that? So I just want to share what this means and why I'm so passionate about this. And I'm probably going to get emotional because I do every time when I talk about this particular case because it's near and dear to my heart. And many of you may be aware, but it's Khalif Browder, who at 16, and at that point in New York, 16 was considered an adult. It was not under juvenile jurisdiction. It was just in 2019 that my two home states, North Carolina and New York, actually moved the juvenile jurisdiction from 15 up to 17, which is crazy. Okay. So at 16, even though he has not been found guilty, he's detained at the horrific Rikers Island that's located in New York, and I can see it when I go on my walks. It's known for violence. It also is right under LaGuardia Airport. And so there's just pollution, the sewer system's bad. It's not just fighting among inmates, but also with correctional officers too. So Khalif is there because his family can't pay bail and because he's insisting his innocence. And so he doesn't take a plea bargain. And he spends 3 years in that violent facility, 2 of which were in solitary confinement. And then upon his release, because the charges were dropped, just a few years later, he committed suicide. And if he were here today, he would be the age of my son. But my son has skin of a different color than Browder. My son is of a different social class than Browder. And so my son didn't experience any of that, even though as an adolescent, he went through difficulties too. It could have put him right in that situation. So I raise that because now I've just told you that even though in the Obama administration, we federally banned solitary confinement, we still have it. There is hope in terms of the age of juvenile jurisdiction. So Vermont is actually increasing the age from steadily to 20 years of age. I think last year they increased it to 19. I think Michigan and Massachusetts are following suit. But even though I say juvenile jurisdiction, for certain crimes, over 20 states have no minimum age in which a child is assigned adult status and transferred to adult court. Assigning adult status to a child is not supported by any biology and psychology that we know of. And so I just wanted to highlight those. But state by state, educating state Supreme Court judges is really helping to make a change. And yeah, state by state is a slow process.
Right. Did you want to respond to that?
Oh, there's so much to say about
I
that.
know.
I mean, I think I know the Khalif Browder story so well, and I think it's been so powerful in terms of narrative change for people to hold that story. But I think what's also important to say is that it's not an exceptional story. There are so many versions of that story that I have worked on personally, and there is the reality of solitary confinement, exactly as you said, but then the functional solitary confinement that's happening, that prisons and jails don't even label as such. I have worked with a number of teenage girls who have been charged as adults, and because they are the only girl under the age of 18 in a particular adult jail or prison, they are functionally held in solitary confinement, sight and sound separated, for their protection for years on end, if you're 15 when you go in with that status. And so it's so pervasive. And then the impacts beyond release, especially in cases like Khalif's, where innocence is maintained, but systems are so overburdened and under-resourced and overworked and all the things that we know. It's years of sitting in these horrible, toxic situations.
I was going to say, some of it isn't about bail, it's just how long it takes a case to go through the system. We tell a story in Parent Nation about, and he was in his 30s, but it took 5 years and got to court, and the charges were dropped immediately. But his child had grown from 2 to 8 or whatever it was while he was incarcerated. Anyway, we need to open to questions. Obviously, there's a whole lot more to say, and we'll circle back to some of this in the panel. But does anybody have a question for BJ or Joanna? Here, I'll just...
I can also just to fill that until someone raises their hand. Another area that we've had discussions where we agree to disagree and agree is all of what I do is about policy change. So I want it to be at a state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court at that level in terms of how we define who a juvenile is and how we protect them from the harshest sentencing of the death penalty, right? We still have the death penalty, and we executed an individual who committed a crime when they were 18, and to avoid mandatory life without parole, yet we still get life without parole even though it's not mandatory to a particular crime. But if we can change those policies in terms of the age and increase those, that's affecting all youth so that we don't have to go case by case in front of a judge where we know that there's subjective bias. And Jen Richardson has a beautiful paper in Science. It's not a beautiful paper, but it's a devastating paper. Our racial disparities, we think that we've changed them in the US legal system. If anything, they've gotten worse.
Okay, now we'll start. Well, here, go ahead. Whoever's got the microphone can go. Oh, okay.
Hi. Yes. Carrie Lamont with Unite LA, a community-based organization in Los Angeles. We've talked a lot about the criminal justice system and policymakers. What about crime victims? What role do they play in this? And is it there's both a communication side, framing, and then also policy. So crime victims can policies are in place that allow them to have a voice in sentencing and in parole hearings. But is there messaging as well to get them to this place of understanding adolescent agency and responsibility? It's so much harder when you're the victim yourself, or it was a member of your family, to get on board with understanding adolescent brain development and accepting that this is part of a life cycle.
Yeah, I think one of the most helpful changes or points of progress that we've had in this work, maybe over the past 10 or 15 years, is the disruption of this binary between victim and offender, or that's the language that we used to use, and really complicating the notion that it is a binary. And I've seen so many circumstances in which folks who have been harmed on the victim side of things also have loved ones, have experienced the harm of the systems on the other side. And so disrupting that continuum and creating space for real conversation from my perspective, has created some of the most meaningful dialogue and willingness to look at the science, to look at the research, to have the discussions. And I think hearkening back to the previous panel, actually, it's the relational piece. It's the humanizing narratives. And I know there's some narrative change experts in the room, but disrupting the silos, imbuing these dynamics with the stories of who the individual is, and what their experiences have been, and where there's more point of connection than there is distance, and honoring the harm that's been caused using restorative justice principles, I think gets us closer to what you're describing.
Thank you for mentioning restorative justice. So I'll go to another place, and that is parole boards. So parole boards often are basing their decision based on what the crime was as opposed to who the individual is. So Ariel Baskin-Summers at Yale and I have been working with groups to come up with questionnaires where we can look at who is this individual when they were arrested at the time of the crime, and who is this individual today, and is there a difference? Because then you have accountability too with parole boards thinking about the change in an individual. So if you go through all those questions and you're confirming, yes, there's been a change, then you're going to be held accountable if you say, I don't want to consider paroling this individual. But that's not the case with most parole boards and that information. But I also just want to say, I don't want to marginalize the victims at all in these crimes. And in fact, in programs where we have ambassadors speaking who have lived that incarcerated experience, they start out by saying, they're not trying to say what they did was good. And that's really a powerful statement too.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
A question for BJ. When you were talking about that policymakers are really hungry for hard age cutoffs, I'm dealing with this as well, as I'll say in the next panel, from sort of another angle, which is when are they mature enough? When are they mature? Are 14-year-olds mature enough? Are 15-year-olds to get their own contraception, to consent to an abortion? And it's hard to answer. So how do you think about this in the context of what we know are vast individual differences, yet policy wants age cutoffs?
Right, so thank you for asking that question, and what a delight it's been to interact with you during this. So one of the reasons I wanted to start out in terms of saying that young people can make decisions even faster or better than us in their early adolescence, in mid-teen years. And in fact, Larry Steinberg and others have data on nearly 1,000 youth showing if you just take a composite of many different cognitive abilities, you see it begins to reach sort of a developmental asymptote by the mid-teens. But then when you superimpose onto that psychosocial development in emotionally charged situations or with peers egging individuals on, then you see that development continuing into the mid-20s. And likewise, when we look at neural correlates of those changes, we see that extend into the 20s too. So part of the reason why I got involved in focusing on the adolescent as opposed to just thinking about development across the life course is because I really felt like we were going to be taking adolescents' rights away if we said they had no prefrontal cortex and they couldn't make decisions, because I knew that wasn't true for me as an adolescent, and I knew that wasn't true of adolescents. And so that's something that I always try to communicate to educate judges and also have them engage in games that we use in the laboratory so they can see when they falter, when they don't, and they can understand the difference between the two, which is powerful to engage them that way.
Have the judges engage in the games? Is
Oh,
that what
yes.
you meant to say? Yes, okay. Or did I understand that? Yes, right. And do they? Are they willing?
Well, they are. You know,
Ish.
It's another story
Okay,
that I
it's
will.
another
yeah.
story. I think there was one more question. Where, Andrew?
Hi, I'm Wesley. I'm a graduate student here at UCLA. I guess this conversation has me thinking a little bit about kind of social perceptions along racialized lines, and in terms of who these judicial systems even see as kids, essentially. Thinking about who may be seen as or tried as an adult more so than others, or in these extrajudicial murders of youth, oftentimes this is in part due to perceptions of threat, of sort of like perceiving individuals to instead be adults as opposed to kids. And so I wonder how we can think about sort of justice for adolescents while also acknowledging that like some individuals are not given the gift of perceived adolescence to begin with.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And the seminal study on the adultification of Black and brown boys in particular is something that we see play out in real terms on a daily basis in the criminal legal system in Philadelphia. We're in a situation right now where we are swinging, even though we have the science, we have everything that we've been talking about today, we are swinging back to super predator tropes and language from the 90s because of the moment that we are in. In a city like Philadelphia, it's the largest poor city, I always get that flipped. In the country, we've had an 80% uptick in gun violence since 2019. The narrative and what you see on the evening news is 18-year-old Black man. 16-year-old, all of the profiling that we know is real, and a desire to return to policies that we know don't work because of exactly what you just described. We have candidates running for mayor who are arguing for a return to stop and frisk, despite all of the evidence that we have that that's not an effective strategy either. And who do we know is going to be impacted by that? Folks who live in communities that are hyper-surveilled and over-policed by folks who perceive 16 and 17-year-old Black and brown boys and also girls who are increasingly getting swept up into this dragnet of the criminal legal system as older than they are. So, sorry, I get fired up about this. I don't know if I actually answered the question. But
Yeah, but I'm glad you raised this too because of Phil Goff's work with police officers perceiving a Black youth suspect to be 4.5 years older than they were on average, and a white suspect to be like a year younger, and also them also rating that they were less innocent if they were Black or brown, and also they endorsed using more force with Black.
So we have really good science on this. So this is an example of something that we're really good science about adultification among Black and brown youth. And it's a good example, I think we can return to this as a theme, but we can't just talk about brain science, right? We have to talk about brain, social, and behavioral science at the same time. What do we know about the concepts of these?
Yep.
And so to me, that's one take home about all this. And this is just a perfect example. We have really good social science about adultification.
Thank you. That was going to be my question, was what does the science say? So